The courtroom felt colder than the winter air outside. Its high ceilings and polished wooden benches made every sound echo, amplifying the single dad's shallow breaths as he stood at the defendant's table. He wore a faded jacket that had seen better days, the sleeves slightly too short, the collar frayed from years of use. In his hands was a thin, overstuffed folder, creased, worn, and clutched as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Inside were school report cards, unpaid medical bills, and handwritten notes reminding him of deadlines he had tried so desperately not to miss. His name was called, and for a moment, he froze. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because saying it meant admitting how close he was to losing everything. His voice cracked as he spoke, apologizing first, not making excuses. He explained that he wasn't asking for forgiveness, just understanding. Since his wife passed away 2 years ago, every responsibility had fallen on his shoulders. There was no one else to pick up his child from school, no one else to sit beside hospital beds at night, no one else to make dinner after exhausting double shifts. He had learned to function on 4 hours of sleep, sometimes less. Mornings began before sunrise and ended long after his child had fallen asleep, their small hand still wrapped around his finger. Some nights, he stared at the ceiling, calculating numbers that never seemed to add up. Rent, food, school supplies, each one a choice that cost him something. Often, it was himself. He skipped meals, sold personal belongings, and worked overtime whenever he could, all to shield his child from the weight of their struggle. As he spoke, his eyes stayed fixed on the floor, not daring to meet the judge's gaze. Shame and hope battled inside him, shame for needing help, and hope that someone, somewhere, would see that he was trying. He finished with a whisper, barely audible in the vast room, "I'm doing the best I can. I just need a little more time." The courtroom fell silent, but the story had only begun. The judge's voice broke the silence, calm but firm, as they began listing the dates and deadlines the father had missed. Each word felt like a ticking clock, loud and unforgiving. Notices had been sent. Extensions had already been granted. The system, the judge explained, ran on rules, not intentions. The father nodded slowly, every sentence landing like a weight on his chest. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He had memorized those dates long before he ever stepped into the courtroom. When it was his turn to speak again, he inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He admitted he had fallen behind, on rent, on paperwork, on payments that seemed small on paper but impossible in real life. He explained how one missed shift turned into 2, how a sick child meant unpaid leave, and how every delay created another consequence he couldn't outrun. He wasn't careless. He was overwhelmed. His hands tightened around the edge of the table as he made his request. Not months. Not forgiveness. Just a few more weeks. Enough time to catch his breath, to stabilize, to prove he could meet every obligation placed in front of him. His voice trembled as he spoke, but there was no desperation in his words, only honesty. He promised he would not waste the opportunity. He never had before. Then, almost reluctantly, he admitted the truth he had tried hardest to hide. There were nights when he went to bed hungry so his child wouldn't. Mornings when he smiled through exhaustion because his child needed reassurance, not fear. He spoke quietly, eyes still lowered, as if confessing these sacrifices somehow made him weaker. Around the courtroom, people shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. The judge listened without expression, pen resting still above the notepad. No interruptions. No sighs of impatience. Just silence, heavy, intentional silence. The father finished his plea and stepped back, bracing himself for rejection. He had learned not to expect mercy. But what he didn't know was that the judge wasn't counting missed deadlines anymore. They were measuring something else entirely: commitment, sacrifice, and the quiet courage it takes to keep showing up when time itself seems determined to defeat you. At the back of the courtroom, almost unnoticed, sat the reason the father was fighting so hard. The child's feet didn't touch the floor, legs swinging slowly from the bench in a rhythm that matched the nervous pounding of the father's heart. Small hands clutched a folded piece of paper, its edges worn and creased from being opened and closed too many times. It was a drawing, simple, uneven lines in bright crayon colors, but to the child, it was priceless. The child watched their father without blinking. Every movement, every breath, every pause in his voice felt enormous. This was not just a courtroom to the child, it was a place where futures were decided, even if they didn't fully understand how. They only knew one thing: if their dad looked scared, they should be quiet. So they were. Perfectly quiet. As the father spoke about missed deadlines and impossible choices, the child's fingers tightened around the drawing. At the top, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "My hero dad." Below it stood a stick figure wearing a cape, holding a smaller hand. The child had drawn it the night before, while their father fell asleep at the kitchen table, paperwork spread around him like fallen leaves. The child had slipped the drawing into their backpack, unsure why, only knowing it felt important. The judge's eyes drifted toward the back of the room, catching the small movement of swinging feet. For the first time, their expression softened. They noticed how the child leaned forward whenever the father spoke, as if silently willing him to be strong. The judge noticed the drawing too, its bright colors a sharp contrast to the dull wood and gray suits surrounding it. Breaking protocol, the judge asked a single, gentle question: "Is that your child?" The father turned, startled. When he saw the child, his composure finally cracked. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he was no longer a man defending himself in court, he was just a father, trying not to fail the one person who depended on him. The courtroom changed then. What had felt like a case became a family. What had sounded like excuses became love. And in that silence, held together by a child's quiet faith, the judge began to understand what was truly at stake. The judge's question lingered in the air, heavier than any accusation. Encouraged by the unexpected gentleness in the courtroom, the father took a shaky breath and finally looked up. His eyes were red, not just from exhaustion, but from holding back a truth he rarely allowed himself to speak out loud. When he began again, his voice was quieter, stripped of formality, stripped of defense. He spoke about nights spent in hard plastic hospital chairs, waiting for doctors to come out with updates he didn't understand, praying he'd hear good news because he couldn't afford bad news. He talked about missed workdays that turned into warnings, then unpaid leave. Promotions he had turned down because the hours would have meant no one left to pick up his child from school. Each decision, he explained, was made with care, even when it looked like failure on paper. The father admitted he was tired, bone tired. He confessed that there were moments when he sat in his car after work, hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead because he didn't have the strength to walk inside yet. Not because he didn't love his child, but because he loved them so much it hurt. He had learned to cry silently, in the shower, where no one could hear and his child would never see him break. He spoke of dignity, how asking for help felt like losing it. How standing in court made him feel exposed, judged not for his effort, but for the outcomes he couldn't control. His voice cracked as he admitted his greatest fear wasn't losing money or reputation, it was losing time with his child. Time he could never earn back. As the truth poured out, the courtroom sat frozen. Even the lawyers stopped writing. There were no objections, no interruptions. This was no longer a defense, it was a confession of love and sacrifice. The father finished not with a plea, but with a promise: he would keep showing up, no matter how heavy the burden became. When he finally fell silent, something had shifted. The truth had done what arguments could not, it had made everyone in that room see him, not as a case number, but as a parent doing everything humanly possible to hold his family together. For the first time since the hearing began, the judge removed their glasses and set them carefully on the bench. The gesture was small, almost unnoticeable, yet it changed the atmosphere of the room. Authority softened into attention. The judge leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the polished wood, eyes no longer scanning paperwork but studying the man standing before them. The courtroom remained silent, but inside the judge's mind, memories stirred. They remembered a cramped apartment from years ago, a parent who worked long hours and came home exhausted, yet always found the strength to sit at the kitchen table and ask about homework. They remembered the fear of eviction notices, the quiet panic adults thought children didn't notice. Listening to the father now felt uncomfortably familiar. The judge asked careful questions, not to challenge, but to understand. How old was the child? Who cared for them when school ended? What support systems existed, if any? The father answered honestly, never exaggerating, never minimizing. He admitted where he had failed, but he also explained where he had endured. With every response, it became clearer that this was not a man avoiding responsibility, it was a man drowning while still keeping his child above water. The judge glanced briefly toward the back of the courtroom, where the child sat waiting, still holding that folded drawing. Their gaze lingered for just a second longer than necessary. That second was enough. Enough to recognize that rulings on paper echoed far beyond legal language. They reached kitchens, bedrooms, and small hands holding crayon-colored hope. When the judge finally spoke again, their voice carried a different tone. Still firm. Still professional. But threaded with something rare in courtrooms, empathy. They acknowledged the deadlines, the missed obligations, and the weight of the law, but also acknowledged effort, sacrifice, and intent. The judge made it clear that justice was not blind to context. As they paused, the father braced himself, heart pounding. He had heard kind words before, followed by harsh outcomes. But this time felt different. The judge wasn't just listening to respond, they were listening to understand. And in that understanding, a door the father thought was closed forever began to open. The judge straightened in their chair, the room holding its breath as the final moment arrived. Papers were aligned carefully on the bench, not as a formality, but as a signal that the decision mattered. When the judge spoke, the voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably final. They acknowledged the law, its deadlines, its limits, its purpose, but then they acknowledged something just as important: humanity. The ruling was unexpected. The father was granted additional time, not just days, but enough to truly recover his footing. The court approved a revised schedule, reduced immediate penalties, and connected him with support services he had never known were available. It wasn't leniency, it was justice applied with wisdom. The judge made it clear this chance was not given lightly, but it was given with trust. For a moment, the father didn't move. The words seemed unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life. Then the weight he had been carrying for years finally broke free. His shoulders shook, and he pressed a hand to his face, tears slipping through fingers that had held everything together for far too long. This wasn't relief from responsibility, it was relief from fear. The judge added one final statement, looking directly at him. "Good parents don't quit," they said. "And today, the court won't quit on you either." The sentence echoed softly through the chamber, settling into the hearts of everyone present. Even the lawyers sat still, aware they had just witnessed something rare. The father turned toward the back of the courtroom. His child was already standing, eyes wide, sensing the shift without understanding every word. When they met, the child ran forward, arms wrapping tightly around his waist. He knelt to their level, holding them as if afraid the moment might disappear. For the first time in a long while, his smile wasn't forced. As they walked out hand in hand, sunlight poured through the courthouse doors, warm and forgiving. The future was still uncertain, but it was no longer hopeless. And sometimes, that is more than enough to change everything.